Thank you very much. Good evening. I want to thank Michael and the leadership for this great opportunity to be here with you to speak this evening, and a special word of thanks for Dr. Steve Hannon for recommending me, as well as the great support that he has for my organization, the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton, and our educational initiative, the Chesterton Schools Network. I apologize, you'll hear me saying next slide a lot this evening. The clicker's not working for us this evening, so I'll have to be telling the computer to advance, but hopefully it goes well. I want to begin by talking a little bit about the background of this talk and why I'm presenting it. I know here at Faith and Ale that there's a rule, and it's a good one, that politics are to be avoided. And I'm not going to talk about politics per se, but I do have to talk about politics as a bit of background. You see, that's the phenomenon that leads to the talk I'm giving this evening. Next slide. You see, I first started thinking about this topic because I was concerned about the quality and the tenor of our public discourse, especially political discourse. You'd need to have been living under a rock this past decade not to have noticed that something is wrong in our civic conversation. Next, please. I began wondering exactly what it was that had gone wrong in our conversation. The question occurred to me perhaps earlier than it did for most people in our culture, though, because at some point in the last decade, I found myself inexplicably and unexpectedly thrust onto the front lines of the culture wars. Next slide. When I say inexplicably, I really do mean that. It was a series of unexpected, unforeseen twists and turns in my life that God apparently had planned, but I certainly didn't. From my perspective, next slide, I felt like I just sort of wandered haplessly into it in the manner of Mr. Magoo. There I'd been in grad school studying poetry and literary criticism. And suddenly, lo and behold, there I was, next slide, on national television, at rallies on college campuses, at city halls around the country, trying to engage in reasoned debate, next slide, about what were admittedly some pretty neuralgic and sensitive issues. I found myself face to face with Antifa and found them to be very interesting people indeed. Next slide. I found that others, though, weren't as interested as I seemed to be in having a conversation, having an argument. You see, we went to various college campuses on a bus tour once, and I would get off the bus and try to have a conversation. These were Ivy League schools. And what struck me is that no one there, student or professor alike, seemed able or willing to have a conversation. Next slide. And needless to say, this tactic has proven only to be less successful as the years have gone on. And so this is really the origin for what I want to speak about this evening. Next slide. Our culture is embroiled in what's called a national argument right now. We know, we've seen it on the news. But this is not what an argument should look like. As a matter of fact, an argument is or ought to be the opposite of what you see on the screen. And yet, whether it's on the streets, next slide, or it's in our homes, or next, over a computer internet connection all around us, we see nothing but terrible examples of how not to argue. And so what we need is a better example, a role model to follow. And so I'd like to propose for that model the person I found to be my role model in having these conversations, and that's GK Chesterton. Next slide, please. Now, I don't have time or space to give a full biography of the great GKC here, but a quick overview will be helpful. And you can just follow along with these bullets if you can. He was born in 1874 to free-thinking Unitarian parents. He was baptized Anglican, but then he was raised agnostic. Throughout his youth, he enjoyed an idyllic childhood, close to his brother especially. And they would dabble together with the planchette, or the Ouija board, as we know it. Eventually, he went on to attend art school in 1892 to 1895. And it was during his time at art school that he had an existential crisis, and he flirted with morbidity and nihilism. But he came out of that dark period at art school, and he realized, he said, that he hung on to religion by a thin thread of thanks. And gratitude became the basis for his entire worldview. Now, he met his friend Hilaire Belloc, whom some of you might be familiar with, in the year 1900. And then he married his wife, Frances, in 1901. And then, throughout the early 1900s, as Chesterton gained fame as a writer and a journalist, something started to happen. All of his friends started to become Catholic. So his friend Maurice Baring entered the Catholic Church in 1909. And then his younger brother Cecil, his best friend from youth, entered the Catholic Church in 1913. And the year after this, Chesterton underwent a very serious and nearly fatal illness. And then, to top things off, after World War I, his brother died from injuries sustained in the war in 1918. And finally, Chesterton had had enough of it. He decided it was his time too, and he became Catholic in 1926. The hardest thing about that decision for him was that his wife was not ready yet. However, she did follow him into the church 4 years later in 1926. And then finally, Chesterton died of congestive heart failure in 1936. Next slide, please. Now, this is just a brief portion of Chesterton's bibliography. So if you're looking for anything to read, you can just search for Chesterton and you will find something that's probably up your alley. He wrote a lot. He was one of the most popular lecturers and writers of his age. He was universally recognized. The Pope, in fact, sent a telegram to the entire nation of England on the occasion of Chesterton's death, offering his condolences to the country. And Chesterton wrote or contributed to over 100 books. He wrote hundreds of short stories and poems, a handful of plays, thousands of essays throughout his life. But more importantly than that was his personal impact that he had on other people. Next slide. C.S. Lewis, for example, attributed Chesterton's The Everlasting Man. Those are supposed to be words. We might just forego slides, I think, this evening. C.S. Lewis attributed Chesterton's The Everlasting Man with a huge role in his conversion from atheism. He said Chesterton was the first person to make faith seem reasonable. This is a quote from C.S. Lewis. In reading Chesterton, I did not know what I was letting myself in for. A young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. Bishop Fulton Sheen was another person who was heavily influenced by Chesterton. He asked Chesterton to write the introduction to his publication of his doctoral thesis. And Sheen wrote of Chesterton, "The greatest influence in my writing was GK Chesterton, who never used a useless word, who saw the value of a paradox and avoided all that was trite." And finally, for a contemporary witness, Bishop Robert Barron, in many ways himself a modern-day Fulton Sheen, has this to say: "Is there anyone in our tradition more exuberant, more effervescent, more joyous, a better writer than G.K. Chesterton? Is there any better apologist? Every page of Chesterton is like drinking champagne." More significant to me, though, are the countless testimonies that we've collected at the Chesterton Society over the years from all over the world. Next slide. This is from our website. These are candles for Chesterton. A few years ago, we invited people, no matter where they were in the world, if Chesterton had an influence in their life, to go on our website and light a candle, and thousands of people responded. And this shows you that on every continent, Chesterton has had his impact. Finally, one last element of Chesterton's biography that's important for our topic tonight. Next slide. Chesterton was famous for his ability to maintain warm and vibrant friendships with people with whom he disagreed. George Bernard Shaw, notably, was one of his good friends in spite of the fact that they agreed upon practically nothing. Shaw was an atheistic, materialist socialist, and worse, perhaps, for Chesterton, he was a teetotaler and a vegetarian. And yet, the two got along famously, which included some good-natured ribbing. Once they were standing together, and Chesterton looked over at the rail-thin Shaw standing next to him, and he said, "Good God, man, anyone looking at you would think there was a famine in England." Shaw, not missing a beat, retorted, "Anyone looking at you would think you caused it." So these two men, despite their differences, maintained a warm friendship throughout their entire life. And it is an example that we ought to follow ourselves. And so now we're ready to delve into these lessons that Chesterton can teach us about having a good-natured argument. I want to begin with a lengthy quotation, which I don't know is going to show up on the screen, unfortunately, but you can hear me out. This is Chesterton's autobiography, written right before he died. He's reflecting here on the earliest and the most important of his friendships, his friendship with his younger brother, Cecil. He writes, "My brother, Cecil Edward Chesterton, was born when I was about 5 years old, and after a brief pause, began to argue. He continued to argue to the end, for I am sure that he argued energetically with the soldiers among whom he died in the last glory of the Great War. We argued throughout our boyhood and youth until we became the pest of our whole social circle. We shouted at each other across the table on the subject of Parnell or Puritanism or Charles I's head until our nearest and dearest fled at our approach and we had a desert around us. And though it is not a matter of undiluted pleasure to recall having been so horrible a nuisance, I am rather glad in other ways that we did so early thrash out all of our thoughts on all the subjects in the world. I'm glad to think that through all those years, we never stopped arguing, but we never once quarreled. Perhaps the principal objection to a quarrel is that it interrupts an argument. Anyhow, our argument was never interrupted until it began to reach its conclusion in the proper form, that is, conviction. I do not say that at any particular moment either of us would have admitted being in error, but as a matter of fact, it was through that incessant process of disagreement that we came at last to agree. And when Chesterton speaks of finally coming to agree with his brother, he doubtless means that they ended, in his words, ended eventually but quite independently in the same church, that is to say, the Catholic Church. As you recall from the timeline earlier, Cecil had entered the church about 10 years before Chesterton in 1913. And I'm sure when Chesterton finally entered in 1922, Cecil from heaven was taunting him, saying that he won that particular argument. But I want to revisit and reiterate a couple of the points in that quotation that I read. Chesterton says that he is grateful that, quote, we did so early thrash out our own thoughts on almost all the subjects in the world. And through that incessant process of disagreement, we came at last to agree. And that through all those years, they never stopped arguing, but they never once quarreled. Now, what is this difference, this definitional distinction between quarreling and arguing? Chesterton seems to assume that his readers know. Do we know? Well, we know what it isn't. We know what argument isn't. As to what it is positively described, maybe we need to repose on that famous line from the Supreme Court Justice describing obscenity. I know it when I see it. You see, quarreling is the diabolical parody of an argument. It has some of the same appearances. People trade point and counterpoint back and forth with heat, sometimes with passion, But see, a quarrel, unlike an argument, is not about winning our opponent's mind. It's about crushing his spirit. It's not about getting to the truth. It's about getting ourselves across the line to a victory. And we can see how the devil would love this as a tactic. That passion for truth, the desire to defend the truth, these are good things. And we know how the devil works. He likes to take good things and pervert them, and distort them and twist them to his own means. And so he loves the fact that we can't have arguments and we instead just have quarrels. And if you think that I'm being exaggerative or hyperbolic by referring to quarreling as diabolical, consider some passages from St. Paul in the New Testament. This first one is from St. Paul's second letter to St. Timothy. He writes, "Avoid quarreling about words, which does no good, but only ruins the hearers. Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a workman who has no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. Avoid such godless chatter, for it leads people into more and more ungodliness, and their talk will eat its way like gangrene." Later in that very same letter, St. Paul again warns Timothy, "Have nothing to do with stupid, senseless controversies. You know that they breed quarrels. And the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kindly to everyone, an apt teacher, forbearing, correcting his opponents with gentleness. God may perhaps grant that they will come to repent and know the truth, and they may escape the snare of the devil." And in very similar language, St. Paul extols Titus. "Avoid stupid controversies, genealogies, dissensions, and quarrels over the law, for they are unprofitable and futile. As for a man who is factious, after admonishing him once or twice, have nothing more to do with him, knowing that such a person is perverted and sinful. He's self-condemned." And yet we know that these stupid, senseless controversies abound in our world and in our homes. And all of these stupid, senseless controversies that we see arising in our daily lives arise from the same source and often have to do with the same subject. I'm not talking about the devil or religion. I'm talking here about toilet paper. Let me explain. In 2021, as part of a marketing stunt in the UK, a UK toilet paper company commissioned a study of British households, and they wanted them to identify the top 50 reasons for domestic arguments. The topic was of particular interest at the time, this is 2021, because people were locked up together during COVID, and obviously having more opportunity to yell at each other at home. So the study found that the average household had 21 disagreements each week. That's on average 3 a day. And most of these were about trivial, stupid subjects. The list of causes and this is why the toilet paper company got involved, the list of causes for these arguments in the home included all of the following: not changing the toilet roll when empty, not putting the empty roll in the bin, but on the floor or on the windowsill, on the back of the toilet, or elsewhere. The infamous question of which direction the toilet paper ought to face on the roll did not come up somehow, but these others did. Squeezing an item on top of the already full trash bag instead of just taking the trash out. Leaving dirty dishes throughout the house, especially in the bedrooms. Or leaving dirty dishes to soak in the sink rather than doing the washing up. And finally, this one's my favorite, number 20 on the list of the top 50 argument causes in the home was who started the argument. But there's another reason that I end with that one, who started the argument. You see, the survey was called the Family Arguments Survey. Respondents were asked what they argued about, in the home. And at number 20 on the list was this one: who started the argument? But none of these things are arguments. They're quarrels. We don't go to our family members and present them with a cogent, multi-paragraph discursus with footnotes on the desirability of toilet paper rolls being thrown away. We fight about it. We yell and we scream. We engage in stupid, senseless controversy. In short, we quarrel. And Chesterton, once again, has a clue for us as to why we quarrel. He writes, quote, "People generally quarrel because they cannot argue. And it is extraordinary to notice how few people in the modern world can argue. That is why there are so many quarrels, breaking out again and again, and never coming to any natural end. People do not seem to understand even the first principle of all argument, that we must agree in order to disagree. Still less do their imaginations stretch to anything so remote as the end or object of all argument, that we should disagree in order to agree." Now, this single quotation from Chesterton is so rich that it's going to be the primary basis for the rest of the evening, the rest of my talk. These are where we're going to get these practical lessons that we can take home and start putting into practice in our day-to-day lives. And so let's begin. Lesson number 1 is this: having a can-do attitude. And can-do should be inflected with a question mark. Can-do. What I mean by that is this: we should ask ourselves the question, can we argue? And for a moment here, let's remember that Chesterton told us people quarrel because they cannot argue. And for a moment here, we're going to have to emulate another great thinker in the Catholic tradition, Thomas Aquinas, because Aquinas liked to make distinctions. And so I would distinguish between two ways of being unable to accomplish something: with respect to the object, the thing being done, and with respect to the subject, the individual doing the thing. Let me use an example here which might help this make a little more sense. If I say I can't drive a car, I might mean one of two things. I don't have a license. I'm unable to drive. I might also be pointing at a car that has no wheels and has been lit on fire. I can't drive that car. That's not my problem, it's the car's problem, right? That's the object problem of whether or not something can be accomplished. And so it is with argument. When we're talking about an argument, some things are that car with no wheels. It can't be driven, right? Or as they say some other places in the South, maybe here in Florida, that dog won't hunt, right? If we mean we're incapable of arguing about something, it might be because the subject is just not rational content for an argument. And this is something that comes up again and again in our day-to-day lives. We know the adage, about taste there is no arguing, or about matters of taste there is no arguing. That might be overly general. There are some objective standards of beauty and aesthetics that we could appeal to. The problem is, who has the time? And are people really willing to listen to that? And yet, think of how many arguments, or quarrels, more properly speaking, how many quarrels we have about matters of taste, about whether this musician is better than that musician, or with our wife over the desirability of a smell in the home that comes from one of her candles, or perhaps at work over the proper way of filing a report, even though it's no more necessarily efficient than another way of doing it. We have to ask ourselves, first and foremost, can this be done? Will this dog hunt? Is this a topic that can even be argued rationally in the first place? And if it can't, we know we're on the road to a quarrel, and we should give it up. We should decide instead to maybe slowly guide someone towards a better opinion of the thing that we'd like them to esteem, right? So if it's an argument about music, maybe somebody thinks that all classical music is just rubbish and they really prefer club techno music, right? Well, they're wrong. But the problem is convincing them that they're wrong takes a lot of work. You have to mentor them. You have to make an exhortative appeal and guide them along to form themselves, to be able to appreciate classical music. And unless you're willing to put in that effort, don't get into a quarrel with them. Just drop it. Because otherwise you're not doing your subject any good and you're not doing that other person any good. Now, lesson number 2 is related to this. In the words of the great Marvin Gaye, it takes 2. This is lesson number 2. It takes 2. We need to decide at the outset, just like we need to decide whether or not the subject is worth arguing about, we need to decide whether or not both of us are in this argument for the right reasons. Here we are talking about the subject capacity, the person who can't drive, right? So we talked about the problem with the car. Now we're talking about the problem with the driver. Again, people generally quarrel because they cannot argue. But again, we'll make a distinction. Some people can't quarrel ever for long periods of time. Children, for example, right? If you find yourself having an argument with a 4-year-old, stop it. You're not arguing with a 4-year-old. 4-year-olds don't have that capacity of reason that is required for an argument. But you might be arguing with somebody older than a 4-year-old who is no less unable to argue right now. We all know that person. Many of us live with that person. Not that they can't argue ever, just right now is not the time to have an argument. And we need to be paying attention to that. The reasons for this are manifold. The reasons are life. All of the things that come up. A stressing work week, bad weather, or a heat wave, illness, indigestion, uncomfortable clothing. All sorts of things can influence a person's ability right now to have an argument. And we should, by the way, always take someone at their word when they say to us, I don't feel like arguing about this right now. If you press them into it, it's unchivalrous. It's like you're sword fighting with someone and they throw their sword on the ground and you proceed to smack them about the head and the neck with the broadside of yours. But it's even more serious than that, because we need to recall what we already learned from St. Paul. That quarrelsomeness can be, and sometimes is, a very serious sin. And if we believe that, and we take that seriously, that means that our baiting a person who will be quarrelsome, our baiting someone who is not in a position or a disposition or an attitude to be able to have an argument right now, could be leading someone into a near occasion of sin. And that's on us. That becomes our moral and spiritual responsibility. So we need to make use, regular use, learn to make use of those incredibly, incredibly valuable words. You know what? Let's talk about this some other time. Let's talk about this in the morning. Let's talk about this next week. Or you know what? It's fine. We don't need to talk about this. We always need to be willing to give up that desire to win, that desire to get our own back, that desire to hear the other person admit that we were right, because we might win the argument and damage their soul. This leads us nicely into our third lesson for the day. This is fitting for Chesterton as a paradox. Chesterton was famous for his paradoxes, his turns of phrase that switched meanings back and forth in clever ways. He writes here that in order to argue, we must agree to disagree. Now, we've all heard this before. We have to agree to disagree. But see, the problem for us is this comes at the end of the argument, right? We've spent time jawing with somebody over a topic, talking interminably, and then finally one or the other of us throws up their hands and says, you know what? We just have to agree to disagree. But for Chesterton, this belongs at the beginning of an argument. Recall another sentence from the passage that we read before. People do not seem to understand the first principle of all argument, that people must agree in order to disagree. That's what argument is. It's agreeable disagreement. Now, this might sound obvious, yet in our day-to-day lives, very few of us ever get this right. And it's so easy to fall off track, especially when you have an undisciplined interlocutor, somebody you're going to have a conversation with who wants to bounce all over the place. And that doesn't do service to the truth. We have to remember that our primary objective with an argument is fidelity to the truth, fidelity to a point that needs to be made. And so we need to address right up front, what is that point? What am I trying to get across in this argument? And we need the other person to agree that that's the central question. Otherwise, we're just going to go round and round. And if they get off track, or if we get off track, we have to call one another back and say, you're off base, you're off point, we're down a tangent here, we need to get back to the central question. Let's take this down to brass tacks and bring it into a very, very pragmatic and practical exigency that any of us as Catholic men or Christian men might find ourselves in. We might find ourselves confronted with a person who wants to argue that a woman has, quote, a right to choose. This is one of those arguments, what could be an argument, but very often isn't. It becomes a quarrel because nobody asks the immediate follow-up question. Choose what? What are you choosing? That's the argument that we have to have. What is actually happening that you want to talk about? What is the nature of the unborn child? Is it a person or is it not a person? Because if it's not a person, then arguing about the right to choose is like arguing.
Let's move on now to lesson number 4, which is related. And this lesson is all about the end of argument. So we read what Chesterton just wrote, that people don't understand the first principle of argument, that we need to agree in order to disagree. He continues, still left to our imagination stretch to anything so remote as the end or object of all argument, that we should disagree in order to agree. Again, is Chesterton just having fun with words here? So we start by agreeing to disagree, and then we disagree to agree. That, if you like, is a roadmap of what an argument is. But what does that actually mean? Well, Chesterton said, few people in the modern world can argue, and that's why there's so many quarrels never coming to a natural end. The natural end of argument is agreement. Again, we shouldn't end an argument with saying we need to agree to disagree. We should always be
seeking agreement. If you're cynical about the goal of argument, if you think, well, the purpose of having an argument, you're never going to convince someone that they're wrong. If that's really your view, then don't argue. We have to give that trust to the other person. We have to have the ability to trust them to change their minds. And we also need to be willing ourselves to really honestly look at our own positions and be willing to change if necessary. And I know that that's very difficult. But think about it this way. Think of it analogously. Suppose that I came up to one of you at the end of this fine evening and I said, hey, I have a deck of cards here. Would you like to play? And you'd say, sure. How do we play the game? I'm like, well, we each get a hand and then we'll take turns. And you'll say, okay, but what's the object of this game? And I'll say, I don't know. And then you ask, well, then how do I win the game? And I shrug again. So then you ask, well, then how do I lose? And I answer, oh, you lose when I win. And now you're becoming a little exasperated and you say, well, how do you win? And once again, I shrug. Obviously, your response to this invitation is going to be, that sounds great, let's play for money. No, it's going to be, no thank you, you're a lunatic, get away from me. That's not a very fun card game, right? A card game only exists, a card game only works because there's a win condition. But how many times do we get into an argument with no win condition? That makes an argument a quarrel. In other words, there's two fundamental questions that we always have to have answered before we properly can have an argument. What quality or quantity of evidence is going to convince me, or what quality of quantity of evidence is going to convince my opponent. And if either of those questions is unanswered, you can't have an argument. You cannot drive down that road that is an argument if you don't have any objective in mind, right? You need to be able to see the road in front of you, the road to victory, okay? And victory is, again, not for you to win or the other person to win, but for truth to be vindicated. That's the goal of an argument. And if somebody point blank says to you, nothing you're going to say will ever convince me that I'm wrong, chances are you're not going to have a productive argument with that person. And so rather than enter into an argument, simply say, well, then let me leave you with just a thought to go away and think about. Don't try to have a back and forth with them. They just told you they're unwilling to change. So don't bother. Plant a seed in their mind. Trust the Holy Spirit to do his job. He's a better arguer than any of us are ever going to be anyway. Finally, lesson number 5. This is related to the former one. And this is kind of ironically butting up against the principle that I invoked at the beginning of the evening, that here at Faith and Ale, you eschew politics. I think that that's a good thing. I'd encourage you to consider occasionally arguing about politics, not quarreling though. See, chances are the reason that you don't want to talk about politics here is because you know that you're going to quarrel. But if you can argue, well, Chesterton says that all men love loud and equal argument. And we know as men that that's a fun thing to be able to do. But what does it require? It requires fraternal charity. It requires trust. It requires brotherhood. And so, ironically, first and foremost, the people with whom you are arguing the most in your life should be the people that you're most fond of and that you care about the most. If you think that the sign of a good relationship is that you don't argue with someone, then I would encourage you to reconsider that. Because if you can't argue with the person who you know has your best interests at heart, who you know cares about you, who you know wills your good, then why would you seek to have productive and effective argument with complete strangers? We need to argue first and foremost with our brothers. This is somewhere in Chesterton's life where he excelled. He began arguing with Cecil as soon as Cecil could talk, and they argued until Cecil died. And whether it was his later friend, George Bernard Shaw, or H.G. Wells, who Chesterton was friends with, throughout his life, he always gained a reputation for being able to argue charitably without it falling into a quarrel. And I think the reason for that is that he always knew how to look past the issue and see the person in front of him and care about that person. And so we need to practice. We need to practice in full gear before we go out for game day. And that's how we'll learn to be better arguers. Hone your skills of argument with your brethren. Of his arguments with Cecil, Chesterton wrote, quote, I think it was a good thing that we had tested every link of logic by mutual hammering. I will even add something that sounds like a boast, though it's meant to be a tribute. The man who had got used to arguing with Cecil Chesterton has never had any reason since to fear an argument with anybody. Cecil prepared Chesterton very well for life. Would that all of us can find a friend in our lives who can do the same for us, who's willing to point out when we're phoning it in, when we've said something that's BS that doesn't hold up to scrutiny, and challenge us to support our ideas so that we're ready to do it when it's a matter of making a defense of the faith out in public. Iron sharpens iron. If you take nothing else home from me this evening, I encourage you to take that lesson. Find a friend and start an argument. I'll close today with one final very important point. I want to preempt the excuses that we might try to make for ourselves. We might feel like, well, this is all very well and good. Chesterton lived in a much more simple time. It wasn't really that simple comparatively. World War I was a bit of a big deal. It's an anachronistic judgment. So consider this quotation from 1917. The contemporary official paper, like the Daily News or the Daily Chronicle, simply cannot argue and simply does not pretend to argue. There's no more curious quality in its degradation than a sort of carelessness, at once of hurry and fatigue, with which it flings down its argument, or rather, its refusal to argue. It does not even write sophistry, it writes anything. It does not so much poison the reader's mind as simply assume that the reader hasn't gotten one. Here we have to recall that Chesterton himself was a journalist, and yet clearly he saw that most journalists weren't up to snuff. He decided to be different. And so is the challenge for us. Granted, any news show you turn on where two talking heads are shouting at each other over the latest crisis in the news, you're not going to see very reliable argument taking place. That doesn't let us off the hook. It doesn't mean that we don't need to be better. As Christians who are called to witness to the truth, we have to have a fidelity to the truth and a respect for it, and that means practicing the skill of becoming good at arguing. I'm going to end with a quotation from another person, not GK Chesterton, but an even weightier, metaphorically speaking, saint and thinker, St. Paul. St. Paul, of course, was a famous arguer himself. He argued with the philosophers of the law. He argued with the scholars, the Pharisees. He argued even with the vicar of Christ himself, St. Peter. Let's listen to what St. Paul has to say to us and go forth heeding his words. I charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, preach the word, be urgent in season and out of season. Convince, rebuke, and exhort. Be unfailing in patience and in teaching. For the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own likings. And they will turn away from listening to the truth and wander into myths. But as for you, always be steady, endure suffering, do the work of an evangelist, and fulfill your ministry. Thank you, and God bless you.